When Psalm 32 opens up, we read, "Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered." Let me ask you something. Do you ever get the feeling in life like you're just trying to play catch up? And I want you to follow me for a minute on this one, okay? Because, we know our sin is covered, yet we react sinfully. So we mess up, we feel guilty, we try again, we mess up, we feel guilty, we try again. It's this weird circle that we kind of put ourselves on. See, we realize our actions are sinful, retrace our steps, promising ourselves that we won't make the same mistake again. It's just this game of catch up. So rather than taking a proactive stance, so many times in life we find ourselves falling victim to a reactive state where we're more emotional than logical in our responses. And for me personally, my entire life seemed to have been plagued by this reactivity. And I'm not saying I react negatively or out of aggression all the time, but check it out. I have 3 kids in this season right now, and they're all young. And sometimes their behaviors that aligns with the sun and the moon and the stars. And there's this tidal shift of craziness in my house where my emotions and my feelings trump any sort of logic or rational thinking. It's just weird. But sometimes even closing myself off from those surrounding me is still a form of reaction. So rather than approaching a given situation where I was unsure of what the result would be, I would lean more towards just shutting down completely. I was very much one who didn't want to rock the boat. But the problem that I found with my attitude is that I really didn't take a stance either way. I was just more concerned with wanting to please everyone, which led to a lot of internalizing things in a very negative and destructive way, which did lead to drinking and drugs and alcoholism and this whole maze of confusion and darkness. And you can easily see the error in this approach to living and my approach to life. So even if I had a voice, which we all do, I was afraid to use it because I was so concerned about making myself vulnerable. And if I made myself vulnerable, what then? What if no one liked me? What if they thought that I was a bit off my rocker in my approach to living and my approach to life and my outlook and my perception? You kind of see the pattern here because I was allowing my fear of what others might think or how they might react dictate my approach to life in a way that hindered any sort of real relationship building. David paints this beautiful picture in Psalm 32 of forgiveness and how when we keep sin captive in our hearts, it leads to anguish and pain. Verse 5, it says, "I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity." He's referring to coming to the Lord unashamed, just revealing ourselves to Him. But when we trust God and move towards Him, you see, it creates this love that can never be achieved outside of allowing ourselves to be vulnerable unto Him. Verse 8 says, "I instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you." And when I read that, I just think, what way am I going? Think about that for a minute. What way are you going? What I realize is that God's guiding this journey, but I need to take that first step. See, God's presence is all around me. It's all around us all the time. But I need to go first and I need to step into that presence. He's already there. He sees us, but we need to move into Him. See, I need to think about how God is going to use my vulnerabilities and fears as a way to draw me closer to Him through trust and love, and in turn closer to others in that relationship. See, I need to make myself vulnerable first and not wait for someone else to go first. See, the thing is, making ourselves vulnerable creates a platform for relationship. See, when Jesus laid down His life, when we read in Matthew 27:50, it says, "Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up His spirit." We are able to see the pinnacle and the climax of a vulnerable spirit. A soul that bared everything so that we could come to Him with nothing except a burden on our back and a faith in our heart. And Jesus came to us not fearing what response He might get. I looked up the definition of vulnerable in the dictionary, and what it says is susceptible to physical or emotional attack or harm. It sounds fun, right? I don't think if you ask anyone what their ideal day would consist of, I highly doubt they'd welcome the idea of some attack on their emotions or their physical body. Most people don't run towards harm with open and welcoming arms. It's not anyone's first choice or second or third for that matter. But check it out. Have you ever been in a relationship? And I'm not talking a strictly romantic one, just anyone, any sort of relationship. And I would like to believe that if you're watching this and you're breathing right now, the answer is yes. And how many times in this relationship where you're just waiting on the other party to make the first move? It's to open up just a little bit so that you could share what's on your heart, to crack the door just enough to see their heart so you can respond out of your own. See, wouldn't it be cool if we all got to the point where we're just fighting to go first, to be the one that can create this platform that invites others into our lives? And when we trust God, that's exactly what happens. See, verse 10, it says, "Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord." See, you see, there's this loving trust that is bred when we are vulnerable to our Maker that establishes a deeper relationship. A relationship that is developed even when our own inadequacies infiltrate our thoughts and attempt to sabotage a bond that is created out of love. Jesus says in John 13, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." The thing is, you can't love in a vacuum. You can't approach people with unconditional love from the comforts of a cocoon. For us to love one another, we have to first realize that God is already aware of our own issues and loves us in spite of them. And he forgives us in light of our transgressions, which enables us to see others with that same sort of compassion. David tells us, he says, "Blessed is the man whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit." The godly aren't expected to be sinless. The godly are the expectant of God's promises. David felt the load of his sins, yet he tells us they are forgiven. And the thing is, we're all forgiven because Jesus went first in approaching this relationship. When he came to earth, he made himself vulnerable. When he came to earth, he exposed himself for all that he is. The suffering he endured for our freedom hinged on the fact that we couldn't do it, and he had to. And it was through that suffering that a loving and lasting relationship emerged. And the thing is, it's totally natural to ask, what if I get hurt? What if I go first? What if I get hurt? What if we're not strong enough to go first in a relationship? These are all very real questions, and there's nothing wrong with that thinking. But don't live in that space. We can visit those thoughts because they're natural, but don't sign a 30-year mortgage on a feeling that was never meant for your growth. We can read in 2 Corinthians, it says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And when we realize our weaknesses as man and turn to God for strength, that's when his power is perfected. It's a matter of coming to that realization sooner than later. Jesus does not want us to live in torment. He does not want us to live in torture. And we have to see where our weaknesses are so they can be perfected in him. Somebody might ask, "Andy, what if I go first and it's not reciprocated?" I challenge you to look at that question in a different perspective and ask yourself, what if you go first and it is reciprocated? What if it's received with love? Think of all the airways that will be opened up, all the blockades that will be removed, and all the bridges that can be built through this vulnerable process. And it's not going to be instantaneous, and it's not even going to be 100%. But like anything that has any aspect of longevity attached to it, there has to be a solid foundation. And that foundation is laid when we embrace our vulnerabilities and move toward one another out of love. And if it's not received, think about what our buddy James says. He says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that testing of your faith produces steadfastness." God will test us. And when we approach him with certain faith, he will acknowledge that. And it will be according to his strength, though, and his timing. The thing is, it's not going to be easy. It's not even going to be comfortable. But I will say this. When you approach out of vulnerability, when you approach out of love, it will be freeing, number one. And number two, it will be very redemptive. A few months ago, I had to approach a situation that was so far outside my comfort zone that outside of God, I wouldn't have had the strength to step into it. See, about 3 years ago, I walked through a divorce, and there was this tremendous amount of pain and torment that's attached to this situation. And for 3 years, almost every time that I would talk to my parents, my ex-wife was the primary subject of conversation. And it finally got to the point where I just couldn't handle it anymore. The toxicity that surrounded these conversations began to lead to resentment towards them. And the unhealthiness of it all was just beginning to take its toll. So through prayer, through counsel, through a lot of reflection, I had to confront my parents in a way that goes against everything that I defined myself as. The old Andy, he defined himself, as shy and non-confrontational, as a people pleaser. But when I invited God into this conversation and approached my parents with a very hard boundary that prohibited the discussion of my ex, I wasn't sure what the response would be. I expected an emotional attack is that defines what vulnerability is. I was waiting for this attack. The result, though, was an invitation to a greater relationship with them, a relationship that was possible because I allowed myself to go first, even though I feared what was on the other side of that door. Some of you might be in a similar situation, not in an exact situation. Some of you might be in a lot deeper of a situation. Or some of you might look at what I went through and be like, that's not a big deal. But to me, we all go through different things that are hard. Individually, what I think is hard is not going to be what you think is hard. But for me, this moment was a pivotal growth spurt in my walk with Christ. And even if you're reluctant to dive into the deeper parts of your heart, then at least just start small. That one little question you've been wanting to ask, or that little idea that you want to share with your spouse or your best friend, but you're afraid to because you're afraid they're going to think that you might be delusional, or maybe your idea is silly to them. That's what you think. Those are the doubts that are in your mind, and it's happened to me before too. But just give it a try and see the pathways that will open up. When we invite God into these moments, we can rejoice in Him because He will come through for us. We read in Deuteronomy 31:8, "It is the Lord that goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed." These are powerful words, and they sound simple enough in black and white, but when applied to life, these are not simple words. This verse is not easy. And the thing is, we're all so very human. We're all so fragile, and we often see our weaknesses so much more clearly than anyone else ever could. And the reason that these people can't see our weaknesses is because their vision is blurred by the examination of their own weaknesses. We all have doubts, we all have insecurities, we all have weaknesses, but God can use those to strengthen you. The Lord's preparing a unique way for every child of His, and He doesn't want us to fear that, because He's right there with us. But we at least need to start moving our feet in the forward direction on this path that He has already established before us, and we cannot stop and set up camp along the journey. We're all going to come to places of discomfort and unrest, but I assure you that God is clearing the way for you so you can forge ahead. The closing verse in Psalm 32 says, "Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart." It says, be glad in the Lord. It doesn't say be glad in your circumstances. It says be glad in the Lord. He will always be there, and sometimes it might not seem like it. Sometimes He might seem so far off in the distance, but we can have faith that He is there with us. He might be silent sometimes, but He is there. And the thing is, making ourselves vulnerable isn't natural, which is why Jesus had to come and show us the way. He came down from the comforts of heaven, and He had to make Himself vulnerable for every one of us. He wrapped Himself in flesh, and He walked this earth as a man. And it was through that vulnerability that we were able to draw near to Him, to form a relationship with Him. What David says in verse 3 says, "For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day." His bones wasted away because he was referring to withholding his confession of sin. And I think we can all relate to that in one way or another. See, I can approach God and I can fill him in on all the wonderful things that I did today. How I really dug into the Word, or I held the door for the sweet old lady, or how I volunteered for another shift in the kids ministry. All good things. I could fill him in all this. Look at all the stuff I did, God. But sometimes I don't want to tell Him about how I cussed someone out on the road, or how I yelled at my kids, or how I doubt my ability to parent sometimes, or even how I feel completely selfish in certain moments. And when we withhold these things, we tend to carry a heavier weight than we were ever intended to carry. And we often forego the joy that God has already established before us. I challenge everyone here to talk to God tonight and ask Him to show you your vulnerabilities, because He sees them anyway. And you can't hide from Him. And I mean that in an encouraging way. He sees my weaknesses clear as day. But sometimes I want to hold on to Him for some reason, because I feel like I have control. But when we let go, we put the trust in his hands, which is where he wants it anyway. Make yourself vulnerable to him because he did the same for us. And as a church, we need to start moving towards one another in a way that we approach God, with openness and honesty and with this childlike curiosity. And oftentimes, we need to move towards the chaos. Even when our heart is trembling in the process, we need to move towards it. Levi Lusko, he writes about running towards the roar. And he wrote a book called Through the Eyes of a Lion, which I strongly recommend for anyone. But what he says is, the way that a lion hunts, the male lion will go out in front of the prey. So when the prey moves towards it, what happens is the male lion will just let out a gigantic roar. And what the prey does is it will turn and it will retreat. But what the prey does not know is that waiting behind it is a whole pride of female lionesses just ready to pounce and attack. So when he's talking about running towards the roar, sometimes the thing that we fear most, we just have to move towards it because what's behind us is ready to attack us. We can run towards the past. It's familiar, but I will say this, it's not fulfilling. It's not going to give you any growth. We need to run towards the thing that scares us. We need to make ourselves vulnerable, and we just need to go into it because God will deliver us through that. Because oftentimes in relationships, the response that we fear is not going to be the response that we get. But we'll never know until we step out into that platform of vulnerability and leap out in faith. Because he tells us steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord. Who trusts in the Lord. Trust in him and rejoice in the fact that he approached us first.